just, you guys have all heard the lessons over and over, and especially the teachers in the back. Average cost buying is a good thing. Average into your mutual funds. We are an average cost seller. So all the positive attributes of an average cost buyer work against us. And that's one of the things, that's why we have to be, in our view, so active. And I know that's been a discussion of active management, but that's why we think we have to be so active in our rebalancing, to be smart rebalancers to raise that cash. Otherwise, average cost buying will work against us when we have to sell.
Okay, we'll move on to something, again, a little bit complicated and tricky. The impact of the SBME program on volatility. So the SBME program, that's our Supplemental Benefit Maintenance Account. That's a very important program for retirees that protects them against loss of purchasing power due to inflation. So today, that program is actually sheltered from investment volatility. It gets a guaranteed investment return equal to the assumed return set by the board. Today, it's 7.5%. But the assets are invested with the defined benefit program together. So in years when we have very good returns above 7.5, SBME gets, the assets get 7.5, and the additional gain gets transferred over to the DB program. But in years when we have a poor return, the opposite occurs. SBME still gets 7.5, and the DB program has to, if you want, eat up the difference. And we wanted to illustrate here what do we mean by this. So last year we had a return of about just slightly above 1%, but for illustration purposes, we showed 1% here, the return we had for the total fund. In the end, after the transfer was done and the SBME was credited with 7.5, what was left for the DB was about 0.5% investment return. So you can see, in years when we don't meet the assumption, the DB program gets less. The one thing we want to point out here is that interaction is going to compound and get larger and larger over time because, and what we are showing you here, if you look at how large the SBME assets are today as a percentage of the total fund, it's just over 6%. But the SBME program has a surplus today, as you know, as was presented to you last June. And with the surplus and with the 7.5 guaranteed, we actually expect the assets of SBME to become a larger and larger share of the total fund. Our estimate is by 2046, it will be almost 15% of the total fund. So what does that mean is that over time, this interaction between the return we actually get on the fund and what the DB plan gets will actually, in years when we don't meet the assumption, which is what we're showing you here, we're showing you again the 1% return. So last year, that translated to about 0.5% return for the DB program. In 15 years' time, because the asset would have grown on the SBME side, you talk about 0.25% return, and in 30 years, that would have translated into a negative return for the DB program. But it works the other way as well. If you go back to, yeah, go ahead.
Okay.
Yes.
Go ahead, Harry.
One more. So that's last year.
Yes.
So the DB is a net negative on that. Basically, the DB is adversely affected by last year's return. What if we looked over it for like the 15 previous years? Is it a wash?
Yes, so generally, we would expect to be a wash over time.
Okay, so but going forward, your slides that come up next, you're saying it's...
So going forward, what we want to point out to is that this volatility. So basically going forward, when we have returns below expectations, the returns on the DB will be even lower. When we have returns above expectations, above 7.5, the DB return will be even higher. So although our median may stay the same, the volatility of these swings will be much greater. And the reason, again, that it becomes more of an issue going forward, something we're going to keep an eye on, is especially in cases where we don't meet the expectations, again, with the limited ability of the board to set contribution rate, it's almost like the interaction between SBME and the DB program will add an additional layer of volatility on top of the ratios that we just talked about just a few minutes ago. So it is just adding another layer of volatility where if our returns don't meet expectations, it will make it even harder to reach full funding.
So the guaranteed 7.5, which is essentially it's your guaranteed 7.5. Who controls that 7.5? I probably should know the answer to that question, but I don't. There's a lot of things that
So
happen.
the law simply says that the SBMA program gets the investment return adopted by the board.
So if the board were to adopt 9.5, we would get 9.5. We
That's
adopt
correct.
4.5, we'd get 4.5.
It's meant to be the return you adopt for funding purposes for the DB plan.
And if that number was adjusted upwards, the volatility would be greater. If it was adjusted downward, it would have less volatility on the DB.
Not necessarily.
Not
I think you would
necessarily.
still see the same amount of volatility, but depending where, if you set if the assumed return is set to what we actually expect to earn. So today it's 7.5. If you were to decide to increase it to 8 because we think we're going to earn 8, or if we decide to lower it to 7 because we think we're going to earn 7, you should not see a change in volatility just because you move it. You may see more gains or more losses depending where we end up with our assumption. But the main point here, just if I can try to put, I'm an actuary, I like to put numbers to things. So if you remember last year when you adopted the risk mitigation strategies, I don't know if you remember, but you were presented with here's the impact on the volatility. And if I recall properly, you were shown an option with and without the RMS. And it showed without the volatility was 13.7% and with it was 13%.
This is what I'm trying to get to.
Yeah.
That's on the investment side. We made a decision to adopt RMS, and one of the assumptions was we were hoping that by adopting RMS, based upon the information that was provided to us at the time, that approach had the greater likelihood to reduce the volatility within the investment side. If we wanted to reduce volatility again, to what extent could we deal with the SBMA, a 7.5 lock? Could that be adjusted or changed to affect volatility here?
Unfortunately, the only thing you would be able to do, and I don't think that's what we are recommending, Rick and I, but all you would be able to do would be, if you're concerned about the volatility on the defined benefit program, what's causing it is the guaranteed return on the SBMA. The only way to remove this would be to have the SBMA assets being credited with the actual investment return.
Thank you. I know you're not recommending
Correct.
that, but
No, we're not. But
flush
yeah,
out.
correct.
Thank you. Thank you.
Tom also has comments.
Oh, I was just going to point out, RMS, this is, I think, refined, wasn't intended to reduce volatility as much as to protect against one specific instance, a dramatic drawdown. And there's a slight difference in what impact on a portfolio.
Chris, you want to weigh in on it?
Sure. Keep in mind, RMS is not as correlated to growth equity, to GDP, which is about 85, almost 90% of our portfolio. So the net effect, Tom, is actually to hopefully reduce the volatility because it's just less correlated. As we've always said, it's not going to protect the fund from losing money. It should just lose less money. It should, as Alan said yesterday, we know it's not going to help on a really short-term event like Brexit that lasts 5 days, but we do hope it would help in a minor recession and then definitely help in a severe global financial crisis kind of environment. And of your consultants, I think one recommended 9 and one was willing to go all the way up to 15. So that will come back to you if it proves out that it works effectively, as you could look at whether you want to increase that over time or not. And then the question will be, is fixed income the other diversifier for you? But we're always looking for ways to dampen the amplitude of the volatility of the plan, yet still make a return.
Okay. Now we'll switch gear a little. We want to talk about something that's referred to often as negative amortization. And here, we just want to make sure you're all aware as board members that when the funding plan was passed, the funding structure was set, especially with the contributions increasing over time. It was set in such a way that if you look at the amount of our unfunded actual obligation today, which is about $76 billion, okay? What we're showing you here is how we expect this amount to be paid over the next 30 years. What we wanted everyone to make sure you're aware is that this amount is going to increase as a dollar amount for the next decade. So you can see we have it going up to $100 billion, then it's going to start to go down to zero. So that's all we wanted to point out here is we want to make sure that, because there may be some critics out there when they see the amount of the unfunded actual obligation increase from year to year, they may say that the funding plan is not working. But that's how the funding plan was designed. So we just want to make sure everyone is aware that it is expected to be fully paid, but we will see an increase in the dollar amount, at least over the next decade. Okay. Now the next little quirk we wanted to talk about, do we have a question on this one?
Can we just go back? Yeah,
Yes.
I just had. So it seems that in all of your scenarios that you presented, that you're assuming that the board always enacts the maximum contribution increase allowed under the law if there's an unfunded liability. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So this includes this includes basically continual state contribution increases of 0.5% every year.
No, so no, in this one, this is just where we are today. And if you look today, the state's contribution at about, I think this year they're paying the maximum set by the funding plan,
Right.
which is 6.311%. And again, I'm excluding, they're also paying toward SBMA, but that rate actually today is expected to remain flat until about 2041, and then then at that time we expect the state portion of the unfunded liability to be fully paid for. The employers, their rate is going up to 19.1, and it's expected to stay near that level until 45, 46.
What I'm saying is, starting next year, the board can increase the state contribution
Correct.
by 0.5%.
Correct.
And so are you assuming here that that's what the board does?
Today, based on what we see, there are no need to increase the state contributions further, based on what we've seen to date, even with the 1% return last year. We still don't see a need. Now,
So,
if we were to,
I see.
what we'll show later is if we were to not meet our 7.5% going forward, then at some point there will be a need to start
Okay.
increasing those contributions.
Okay,
But
so-
right now,
so this,
as we
this
stand,
graph here does not assume
Correct.
any, thank you. That's all.
correct. There are no need for this right now. Correct.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, now we wanted to switch topic again, talk about something we call internally the orphan unfunded actual obligation. That's something it was discussed with you 3 times already. I think that the first time was when the funding plan was passed. So we want to just spend a few minutes again to just talk about how the funding plan was set, if you want. So the board today, you have the authority to adjust the state rate and the employer contribution rate. When you adjust the state contribution rate, as per the funding plan, the state is responsible for any unfunded actual obligation that may occur for the pre-1990 benefit structure. So if you look at all the benefits that were in place in 1990, and it's also based on all service, then the board has the ability to adjust employer rates, but only for the portion of the unfunded liability that can be attributed to the benefit structure that's been adopted after 1990. And in the funding plan, some language was included to say, but only for service up to July 1st, 2014. So that means now we have potentially a piece of our unfunded actual obligation for which the board has no authority to adjust contribution rate. When the funding plan was passed in 2014, the unfunded actual obligation that existed at the time was fully accounted for, and that entire unfunded liability was scheduled to be paid off. what's happened is since then, we've had 2 years of return below 7.5. So now we have a very small unfunded actual obligation related to the post-1990 benefit structure for service after 2014. And here on this chart, we're showing you the breakdown of our unfunded actual obligation today. The dark blue is what the employers are responsible for. The light blue is the state. And the sliver of white there is the portion for which, as a board, you have no authority today to adjust contribution rates to pay for this. So the issue is that if we were to have, years where the assumptions are not met, that white sliver here could increase. But if we were to go to a period where we exceed our assumed return, it may disappear. But right now, there's nothing you can do on contribution rates to pay for it. Now, one of the reasons we are still projecting to actually, as we showed you earlier, fully pay the unfunded actual obligation by 2046. And here you can actually the 3 portions again. So you consider the light blue in the middle, which is the state. It's actually scheduled to be paid by about 2041. You can see it on this. The dark blue, the employers, we right now expect it to be paid in 45, 46. And the white sliver, although it's never going to technically be paid off, we still expect the plan to be fully funded by 2046, and we'll explain to you why right now this is still the case, okay? Once both the employer portion and the state portion of the unfunded liability are fully paid for, contribution rates will revert back to their pre-funding levels. So you have member contribution rates coming in. And right now, by then, 30 years from now, we expect most of the teachers of our members to be covered by the 2 at 62 formula. These members pay 9.205%. The employers would go back to their 8.25% contribution, and the state contributes 2.017%, about 2%. So in total, we will be collecting about 19.5% in contribution. That's the base contribution. And then when you look at the 2 at 62, what we call the normal cost rate, the cost of the benefit, it's about 16% of payroll today. So what's going to happen after the state and employers have finished paying their portion, we're actually going to collect more money than the value of the benefit. Now the risk here, next February, you will be considering changes in actual assumptions. And we'll talk about that in the next item. The life expectancy has gone up. I'm sure you'll be having a discussion surrounding our investment return assumption. Depending where we end up, at least on the life expectancy side, I can tell you that any change we make there, it's going to result in an increase in normal costs. So the risk we run going forward is if we make changes, enough changes to the assumption to push that normal cost at a level up or above the base contributions, then we would sort of lose that, if you want, funding for that orphan unfunded actual obligation. So we want to make sure you were all aware of this interaction. Any questions on this before we move on to the next little topic? Okay. So for the rest of the presentation, we wanted to bring into focus what we've already talked about, the largest driver of volatility for us, which is investment volatility, and how it impacts the funding levels. So let's look first historically. I always like to look at this. It's the 40-year history of our funding levels. You can see where we came from. You can see where we've been and where we are today. You can see in the late 90s when we were overfunded. Today, we estimate our funded status to be about 65%. Now here what we show you is our investment returns for the last 20 years or so. And the red line you see here is the assumptions we had for that particular fiscal year. It's hard to tell, but the red bar is actually slightly decreasing in here, the red line. Now what we like to look at for us as actuaries is actually the difference between what you assume and what you earn. So now we've taken this information and converted it into a different chart. When you see a white bar on this chart, that's a year in which we had a return greater than what we assumed. The red bar is when we missed the mark. But what I want you to keep in mind is when we missed the mark, we had a discussion earlier. So if you look at 08-09, when we had a negative 25% return, our assumption that year was 8%. So we actually missed the mark by 33% that year from an actual perspective. So what I want to show you now, I'm just going to add the funded status line to this chart. And I want you to see how when it's white, generally the funded status goes up. When it's red, it goes down. You can kind of see that on a short-term basis, the biggest driver of our funding level is investment return. Now, on a long-term basis, funding policies and contributions will make a big impact, but short-term, that's the biggest driver. Okay, any questions on this? So now let's look at the future. So this is assuming we earn 7.5% every year into the future. And we did reflect the return we had last year, which was about 1%. So you can see our funding level dropping first. The white line is our current projection, reflecting the funding plan. And we inserted on this chart, and we did on most of the upcoming chart, where we would have been without the funding plan. So again, just to keep in perspective, we're expecting to reach full funding by 2046. Without the funding plan, we would have run out of money by 2050. Even though we're making 7.5, correct. That's the key thing to remember there. Even if we had made our assumptions, we would have run out of money. So without those additional contributions, we were running out of money. But now we are projected to reach full funding. Now, what we wanted to show you is what would happen if, at least over the short term, we were not to meet our expected return of 7.5. And for the first illustration, what we've selected, again, is just one example. We selected what we call the 25th percentile of our compounded return. So there's a 25% chance that our compounded return for the next 5 years is going to be 3.4%. That's basically what you get when you look at our current asset allocation with the expected return and volatility. So what we did here, we said, what if we earn 3.4% each year for the next 5 years and then earn 7.5 afterward? So you can see the funding level drop. If you look at the white line only first, you can see the funding level drop to actually about 55% funded. And then from that point forward, as you exercise your authority as a board to increase contribution rates, you see the funding levels go up. And Paul, this kind of answers, in this situation, we are assuming that the board will exercise its right to raise contributions in the case of the state by 0.5% a year. So you can see funding levels in this case do not reach full funding. We get to about 90% funded, but we don't reach full funding. But again, keep in mind, we would have run out of money in 2040 without the funding plan. So that's the other thing you want to keep in mind here on this chart.
Well, David, finish with your next two scenarios, and then I'll make a comment.
Okay, so.
Yeah.
So what I wanted to show you next is the same chart we showed you before, are projected on fund actual obligation, broken down by the pieces. The dark blue is the employer portion. The light blue, the state. The white is what we call the orphan piece. Again, because we're not meeting the assumptions for the first 5 years, that white sliver that keeps increasing, we never collect any contributions toward it, so it never gets paid off. The employer, actually that portion gets fully paid off. The state, because of that 0.5% of payroll limit by which you can increase contributions, and again, if you keep in mind the discussion we had of the volatility ratios before, where there was potentially, when we have losses like that, in a perfect system, if you had full authority to adjust contribution rates, they would have to increase by more than 0.5% a year of payroll per year. But because there is that limit, it adds this additional risk that we may not reach full funding. And that's what you see in this example. Again, we are still at a good 90% funded, which is much better than where we would have been. But in this case, we don't reach our goal of being fully funded. And just to answer your question, Paul, on this, you can actually see in this example, the state's contribution has to increase by 0.5% of payroll every single year until it reaches about 20% of payroll in 45, 46. So you can see that the one thing I want you to keep in mind is the state is really the entity most at risk going forward if we have experience below what we assume. Not the employers, it's the state. And the main reason for this, the state is responsible for anything related to the pre-1990 benefit structure. This is really what accounts for most of our liabilities today. Over 80% of our liabilities today are for that pre-1990 benefit structure. So if we don't meet our assumptions, it's that portion that's going to be impacted the most, which means it's the state that's going to bear most of the cost impact.
Go first. Go ahead.
Before we get into discussing it.
Can you go back to the pie chart that shows the state having kind of a small sliver?
Yes.
That's the part that confuses me. So
Okay.
how do we get from there to the other chart that looks like a big whale?
So again, we
The
are
state looks like a big whale.
No, so we are
the other
talking
one-
about two different things. So,
Okay.
So the funding plan was set to pay the unfunded actual obligation in place in 2014. This is how it looked like in 2014. More than 75% of the unfunded actual obligation at that time was for the post-1990 benefit structure. But going forward, if let's say we don't meet when our returns are below expectations,
I see, because the unfunded
the
is
new
growing.
unfunded liability that's
I
going to
got
be
it.
created in the future, at least 80% of it will be
Got it.
associated to the state.
So that state
Correct.
portion gets so large if we don't meet targets year after year after year, because that triangle.
But if we don't meet it one year,
got
the
it.
year after we have a good return and it balances out, then everything's going to work out okay. The risk here is if we have a prolonged period of lower than expected return, this is where we could get in a situation where we may not be able to reach full funding.
So, yeah.
So,
Never
so
mind.
to follow up on that, and then I'll get to my other question. Because of the actuarial approach that the board adopted, right? We adopted after the passage of the law, then Milliman and staff came to us with a proposal about how to do the allocation of the change in liability if there's a deviation from our 7.5%. Because of the way we made that decision, what it basically does is it says that any deviation from the 7.5%, either up or down, has an impact almost entirely on the pre-1990 liability and therefore the state's obligation, and not on the employers. And so therefore is there anything that, given that allocation approach that we adopted, is there anything that would happen, that could happen, that could in a meaningful way change the liability of the post-1990 benefit structure?
Before you answer that, David, Paul, could you repeat that?
Sure. So remember when sometime after the passage of the funding bill,
Right.
we had a rather complicated agenda item, which was how to allocate the change in the overall funded status between the pre-1990 benefit structure and the post-1990 benefit structure. And if you also recall, a little bit later, the Legislative Analyst's Office came out with a report saying, whoa, what do you guys do there? Because it didn't seem to make sense to them. Because what it doesn't do is it doesn't proportionately, in other words, if the unfunded liability of the system as a whole drops by 10%, the pre-1990 unfunded liability drops by a lot more than 10%, and the post-1990 benefit structure liability hardly changes at all, or changes a lot less. I don't. And so when we do well, it's credited to the pre-1990 benefit structure. When we do badly, it's credited against the pre-1990
Okay.
benefit structure.
For
And so
some
that's
reason-
why David was able to go from the first graph that Irena was pointing
Right.
out to, that second graph, which just a year later, all of a sudden the state's share is much larger. And that's because specifically of the policy that this board adopted, right? I mean, because we could have adopted a policy that said it moves proportionately.
I'll insert, and if Rick wants to chime in, he can, but my understanding is what the board adopted in November 4th or February 15 was a direct reflection of it. It's what the statute says as well. So it's in statute as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what the LAO questioned. So, and I don't think we're here to debate that right now. I guess what I'm trying to understand though is does that mean that there's nothing that we're ever going to see that would change the in other words, is that always going to be the case, that basically if we just do worse and worse and worse and worse, it's just going to be more and more and more of a burden to the state? Does it ever turn into an increased burden to the employers, recognizing that there's a very small limit to which this board can increase the contribution, but just in terms of measuring the share of the liability?
Not under the current funding plan.
I see. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So basically, what we're looking at is a situation where the risk is either to the state or to the system or both, depending on what this board decides. Whether the board decides to exercise its authority to increase the state contribution by 0.5% per year. And what you're always assuming, and again, right there, you're assuming that every year for 30 years that this board increases the state contribution by 0.5% per year.
Correct. Yeah,
Right.
we've made the assumption that the board will
Right.
Act and adopt the recommendations from the actuaries.
So the state's contribution in total gets to what after?
Yeah, 20%. Basically, if you look from where we are today, if you add 0.5% a year, the most it can ever get to is about 21% of payroll.
Because then the funding plan disappears.
Then technically, if the funding plan is not extended, if things stay as is,
Right.
it would revert back to 2% of payroll.
So I would.
If
In 2046.
That's a pretty good guess.
That's an actuary question.
that's right.
Come on, he's a numbers guy. If there's anyone in the room, it's David.
That's right.
Okay, we are really looking forward to the raises that we're gonna get between there and now and then, so I mean.
And I just have one more thing on that, which was, I think that's I guess I can't imagine, well, let's put it this way. It may well be a reasonable assumption that this board would continue to increase the contribution rate by 0.5%. But that's sort of like saying there's no funding problem over at CalPERS because they have unlimited authority to raise rates whenever there's an unfunded liability. And that's not kind of the way we look at things, right? I mean, we look at things by saying, there's a problem here. What's the problem? Now, can it be addressed? And what does the problem look like after it's addressed? So I think it would be actually useful to sort of see, well, what does the problem grow to if we don't take the remedies we have the authority to take? And then, okay, then here are the remedies, and that's the board's prerogative to take those remedies.
I think you get to that either way, but just hearing the absolute dollar amounts, either in today's dollars or future, would just be helpful in just seeing what the magnitude of this is.
So basically, today the payroll for the teachers is close to $29 billion, or close to 30. 21% of this, you're talking about above, more than $6 billion in contributions versus the 6% we collect today, which is probably in the $800 million range. Did I do that right? Yes. So you can see the order of, it's a significant increase in today's dollars. We'll keep going.
Yep.
So we just want to show you also, same idea, if we were to have long periods of time of low investment return, keeping in mind that 25th percentile we talked about, that's the same line we showed you before. If we earn 3.4% for the next 5 years, that's if we were to earn 4.5% for the next 10 years, which is also a 25th percentile. And the next bar, the blue one that just appeared, that's if we were to earn 5.1% for 15 years. Again, the main point we want to make here, you can see improvement in funding levels every time after once we start earning 7.5% because of the board's ability to raise contribution rates, but we never reach full funding, again, mostly because of that orphan piece we discussed and because of the limit of the 0.5% of payroll in the state contribution. Then what we did also, because all we showed you now were just scenarios. So what we did is we performed 5,000 what are called Monte Carlo simulations for the next 30 years. For each of them, we calculated what contribution levels would be, funding levels. Then what we're presenting you here is the 25th, 50th, and 75th percentile of our funding levels over the next 30 years. And you can see under the 50th percentile, we expect to be fully funded by 2046. The line at the bottom, which is a 25th percentile, we end up at about 50% funded. And keep in mind that in our modeling, 25% of the time we ended up below that line. 25% of the time we ended up above the white line, which is 160% funded by 2046. And the rest of the time we were between those two lines. But just this is where we are. And what we want to show you again, keeping in mind where we came from, same 3 lines, they're dashed now. So those are before the funding plan. So you can see the 25th percentile around 137, the 50th percentile by 45. So you can see we're in a much better place today than we were before.
Question, just a sec. But I was looking at, could you put that chart back of the
This one?
the one before?
This one here.
Yeah. So the variables you're working with are basically only the investment returns and how they fall?
Correct, yeah. Right now for this, all we varied was the investment return, correct.
Is it the average return or the way returns fell in different periods of years?
No, we basically just simulated returns going forward based on the characteristic of the asset allocation you adopted last year.
Right.
With the expected return it had, with the 13% volatility, with the RMS. Using this, we basically use a statistical model.
That said equities might earn 6 1 year, 9 the next.
Correct, and yeah, exactly.
So, yeah.
So we had years where we had, a great bull market. We had years where we had, poor returns. It was all over the place.
But it starts with the assumption in all cases that it's our actual experience.
Okay.
No, so the first line you see here, because 2015 is the most recent valuation we've done. And then since we know we earned about 1% return last year,
right. That's
what you see 16, the funded status drops. And then after that, we started our simulations after 2016.
Similar to the issue with the SBMA kind of creating a drag on the DB in 10 years, is there any effect of the non-state share of the liability having a drag? So the school portion getting a benefit of having additional state contributions in all those years. So in the scenario where you're saying the losses get applied only to the pre-1990 liability, and then we're going to keep increasing the state contribution, no additional school contribution comes in, does that have an effect of keeping the school liability flat? Or is that exactly what's happening because of the way the statute reads in terms of isolating the, I don't know if my question's making any sense, but it still it's still puzzling to me how it works out that the state is the only one ever increasing the contribution. I get that the liability grows, so that I understand the difference between those two charts in terms of the magnitude of the unfunded liability, but the outcome where, I mean, the entire plan was based on this kind of shared responsibility concept. So the outcome where the state contribution just grows for all those years without any additional school contribution is still a little confusing to me.
Yeah, right now it's sort of an implication of the funding plan, and you have, I'm not sure if you were here in November of 14 when Milliman tried to explain the difficult interaction of the funding plan, but right now the way it's structured, the employer contribution rate will increase if we have returns above 7.5%. I know it doesn't make any sense, but that's the way it's structured right now because of the way that the funding plan can allocate the assets. It allocates more assets to the pre-1990 benefit structure than we actually have in a portfolio today, which means the employers have a negative share of the assets associated with them. So when we have good return, the negative share gets bigger, so it's more negative. And when we have poor return, it becomes less negative. I know it's kind of counterintuitive, but that's the funding plan we have to work with. So we have this weird situation where if this year we end up with a 20% return, it would be great for the portfolio as a whole. The employer contribution rates would be on the upward trajectory, and the state would be going down. The opposite, if you see that slide here, I'm not sure if you picked it up or not, but this is a scenario where returns are below expectations, and look at the employer contribution rates. They go down. This is sort of what we've been dealt right now. This is what we have to deal with. And right now, we're going to have, at least for the next, potentially for the next decade, if not more, this is what it's going to mean. When we have good returns, the employer rates will go down, the employer rate will go up, the state will go down, and vice versa. Okay.
Back to the Monte Carlo simulation. We're living in the 75th percentile case, something around that neighborhood. At some point, the state share of the unfunded liability is satisfied, correct?
Yes.
And then what happens?
So the moment that either the state or the employer's share of the unfunded liability is fully paid for, at least in the case of the state, the contribution rates would revert back to their pre-funding level, which is simply 2% of payroll.
It means the pressure will stay on the school districts and the...
Correct. And the employer is the same thing. Once their portion is paid off, their contribution rate will go down, but on the employer side, we cannot reduce them by more than 1% a year. So once they reach 19%, to go back to the original level of 8%, it would take 11 years.
Okay.
While the state has no, we call it the express elevator, they can go from they could go from 10% to 2% in 1 year. Not
but it's the employer side that cushions the employees.
Yes. Okay. We're on the home stretch here. Huh? We will, real quick.
Before everybody goes home.
That's correct, yes. We're pretty much done here.
Before the end of the meeting.
Yes.
Not necessarily.
No, we're pretty much done here. I'll go quick through these. We just wanted to kind of, doing our simulations, look at the probability of reaching full funding level. Just want to show you the white bars here is the current funding structure, orange, the pre-funding plan. The main message here, two things. We cannot guarantee we'll reach full funding. You can see just above 60%, but we are in a much better place than we were before. And if you look at the opposite, the likelihood of running out of money, of seeing low funding level, if you focus on the right-hand side of that chart, the likelihood of running out of money was more than 50%. Now it's a slight sliver, almost zero. So great achievement. And the last thing we wanted to mention was, since this, as we've discussed, the state is right now the entity more at risk of seeing high changes in contribution rates, we just wanted to kind of provide if you want, probabilities of these events occurring. And bright orange to wake everybody up. Yes.
Yeah. Go ahead, Paul.
So if we go back to what where you were saying, if we look at the 25th percentile of where our returns would be for, never mind, I answered my question, never mind.
Okay, so we're pretty much done. We just want to give everybody a reminder. The three big decisions coming your way over the next few years: the expense study in February. April, you'll be asked to adopt the valuation and the state rate for the first time, which could, depending where we end up with the expense study, may mean a increase in the state contribution rate. And for the employer, you'll look at spring of 21 before you act on this. Thanks for your patience.
So all of this was assuming 7.5%.
Correct.
And all of it was assuming as well that any contributions that this board had authority to implement, we would. So when we look at the experience study, and I'm not sure who this question should be addressed to, but are we going to see some of these risk measures at different actuarial assumptions other than 7.5%?
Yeah, right now our plan is these risk measures that we presented, we're hoping that maybe they'll become part of any decision the board makes, either on the asset or the liability side. So in the future, if you're looking at different asset allocations and you're wondering what it might do to the funding levels and some of these risk measures, we were hoping to try to present that to the board, and same thing with the expense study as well.
Great. I really, this was such a wonderful presentation, and I really congratulate the two of you and everybody else. To see this was very illuminating, I think, to all of us. A little surprising in some ways maybe, but very illuminating. Thank you.
David, just on the slide before this, just on the board decisions, we don't have anything on here that were relative to the PEPRA issue.
No, we don't. So I'll bring. So I just want
to make sure all the decisions are before them when they see this chart.
So for those, just to remember, when PEPRA passed in 2013, that's the Public Employee Pension Reform Act, it had a provision in it that says that PEPRA members have to pay half of the normal costs, which they did when it was passed. The contribution rate was 8%, just happened to be half the normal cost. Then it has a provision that says once the normal cost changes by more than 1%, members have to pay for half of that increase. So we don't know yet. There is a possibility depending where we end up with the assumptions, that it could trigger an increase in normal cost of more than 1% and could increase member contribution rate.
Thank you. And thank you for explaining about the PEPRA rates. That was one of my questions too. And this is a fantastic presentation. And my question might be more broad, maybe for you, Jack, but what outreach has the staff been conducting with stakeholder groups and employee groups, member groups?
Well, this is like the 10th time you've done this probably, but they've done in terms of, they've done a briefing for the legislative staff, just the key policy-making staff, on the Assembly and Senate side before this, and then they've done at least 3 or 4 stakeholder presentations, I think, on this as well. So, I mean, we're trying to do the core groups that interact with us. Our intention would be to do the same approach when the experience study is prepared in a final form, so that prior to your February 1st meeting, we do the same kind of repetition. And Irana did mention that we offered to do it with her colleagues. It wasn't so much her as a board member, but we wanted to get the finance staff, because, I mean, I think you all appreciate how much the Department of Finance is affected here. So we did a briefing for them as well.
And does that include the employer groups, school districts? And I'm asking that because, CalPERS is going through a discount rate discussion as well.
Yeah.
And they surveyed over 600 employers, and probably in the high 70% of governmental agencies, except for school district, were very well aware of the discussion and what the implications would be. And only about 52% of the school district employers were focused on this. So I'm just curious if you've had a better response.
We've not done direct education. I'm trying to think if we've done anything out with the employers. I guess we haven't really done specifically, given their locked-in rates with, there's nothing. We want them to understand the bigger picture, but there's nothing. It's a bit different situation than what CalPERS, of course, is going to do with relative to their employers.
But hopefully they are tuning in because 2021 will be here before you know it.
Well, it's funny, I had to interview someone the other day that was on a local school board for a job here, and I said, well, hey, how often does your school board talk about CalSTRS?
Mm-hmm.
And her reaction was, before, never, now every board meeting. And it was not in a pejorative way did she say it to me. She said, now our CFO is talking about the presentation of the budget, and we hear about the rate changes, and we have to understand that. It's just one school district, but it was interesting to see what a night and day interpretation of our situation. Because my own experience has been, and Dana's had this with me, when I've gone out personally with school boards, it's a rather naive understanding of the financing of the system, really. Now that we're at heading toward 19.1 and potentially higher, there's definitely an awakening.
Thank you.
So I guess when Jack and I were going out and about talking to school boards and school administrators, it was really surprising that they didn't have a clue about the unfunded liability. While both of their associations were being briefed and giving input and talking with us on a regular basis. So the information that was coming out from the associations that represent them, they weren't paying any attention to that. And that was really amazing to us.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Well, thank you. That's very illuminating presentation. I think as we push our way forward, it'll be interesting to see sensitivities to other assumed rates of return and what happens to your curves in terms of funding and unfunded. If, how different does the world look at 7? How different does it look at 6.5? My sense is it'll be quite dramatic at each step down the stairway. But I'm sort of guessing at this point.
Yeah, this was one of our plans to try to keep in mind that this was our first ever report on our funding levels and risks. Going forward, we're probably going to try to expand in new areas. I think one of which is what you just mentioned. We were also thinking about maybe looking at sensitivity on how long our members live, things like that, because there are other assumptions that impact all of this as well.
Just, do you have a guess at your 50% curve in the Monte Carlo simulation, what the average rate of return was?
In what we use, I think it came in at about, I think close to 7.3% is what we had.
So that
again, it's what was simulated, and it was sort of a reflection. If you look back to the information that was presented to you last November on the asset allocation, the expected return was, when you factor in administrative expenses, was a little bit below 7.5.
And so the high curve, what was the likely average return?
I think it was 9% and about 5% for the 2050.
1.5 has that much impact, and the low curve?
About 5%.
5?
So it was almost 2.5% each way.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Thank you, gentlemen. We really appreciate it.
And we're not going anywhere.
I know you're not going. I know you're not going.
You're not done with us.
So, taking a look at the rest of our agenda and taking a look at time, and knowing that we have at least 2 board members that might possibly be leaving us within the next 45 minutes. Brian has graciously offered to send us the cybersecurity report as a written document. As long as that is okay with the board, I think we'll go ahead and do that. That'll take some time off our agenda. I want to apologize to those of you that are coming towards the end of our agenda and the reports that you have to give. We had a couple really beefy items on our agenda today, and we fully vetted them, and that's kind of put us behind schedule. So we apologize ahead of time. So board members, if you need to leave the dais I would love to take a break, but I don't think we can afford to take a break. If you need to exit the board meeting, feel free to. And so Rick and David will go right back to you for the mortality improvement.
So did you say, we were going to say, this is definitely the most important item left on the agenda since it helps on February. Did you still want to do the oversight items? If you don't, I can let those people go in the audience, and we've got people waiting for
I
you.
think that there are members of this board that think that the projects that they're reporting on are extremely important.
So you want
and
to keep
so
them?
I
Okay.
think that we would want to keep them.
Okay.
And I might be reading that wrong, but I'm thinking that we would still want to hear the update in the, all righty. I think we'll keep a quorum.
A quorum. Got it.
I think we'll keep a quorum.
All right.
So, yeah, let's go ahead and go forward.
So we're going to discuss mortality improvement trends. In February, we're going to present our recommendations for changes in our mortality assumptions. These are very important. We're also going to talk about generational mortality, which we've mentioned before. So with that, I'm just going to hand it over to David since we're running a little short on time.
Yeah, and on the interest of time, if there's a desire, we can go quicker. I can skip over some of the slides to just make some of the high points. Because I know last October you had a wonderful presentation, which I had the chance to watch afterward on aging, and so some of the information may be similar. Okay, perfect. So first thing we want to talk about are changes in life expectancies. You know, as a society, it's great. We've seen tremendous improvement in life expectancies. But for us, we're in the business of providing retirement benefits. So it creates a financial challenge. So we first want to show you, whoops, my clicker, there we go. Information about life expectancy in the U.S. And this is information we gathered from the U.S. Census Bureau website. Life expectancy at birth from 1900, then 1950 through 2010. You can see tremendous improvement. We've added, at least since 1900 at birth, added more than 30 years of the life expectancy. Now, for us, we're a retirement system, so we like to look at age 65 as being something more meaningful for us. And you can see even that continuous improvement over time. But the main point we want to make here is, in February, you'll be asked to adopt mortality assumptions, and built into it will be an assumption about improvements into the future. And I want you to focus on this next chart here, which what we did is we looked at one decade, we compared one decade to the previous one, just to show you how mortality improvements differ greatly from decade to decade. So you can see that in the between 1950 through 1980, female had a much greater improvement in life expectancy than male. But for the last 30 years, it's been the opposite. So you can see, you could go through one decade of very slow mortality improvement, and others see great mortality improvement. So that's just something to keep in mind. Then let's look at our own experience here. So for us, we were able to gather reliable data going back to 1991. So what you have here is we did it for 5-year periods. You can see our own life expectancy for our members going back to 1991. So you can see, again, in the 90s, the life expectancy didn't increase too much, but then since then, it's been steadily increasing. And again, you can see that our female members, which comprise the vast majority of our membership, live much longer than males. Right now, it's about 2 years longer. Now, we often get that question, you know, you hear that teachers live longer than the rest of the population. We just wanted to show it to you in a picture. The light gray is the data that Social Security uses for their actual evaluation. That's the light gray. The dark gray is CalPERS across the river, what they assume in their evaluation. And the orange is us. And what I want to point out here, that's the assumption used by the actuaries. So I know CalPERS did a study fairly recently. Social Security update theirs every year. Ours has not been updated for 5 years. Once we update ours, that difference is going to be even greater. So I just want you to keep that in perspective. But our teachers live longer than the rest of the population. You can see it here.
So this is the most recent first one?
Yes, so that's the most recent assumption CalPERS uses.
Wow.
So you can see, even though our assumptions are outdated, we still assume longer life expectancies than theirs, which is a reflection of the membership.
Are we going to hit 90?
We will. I think right now what we're seeing is we most likely will go above 90 for females.
Yes.
Wow.
And this is for an age 62 retiree, which is our typical retirement age for our members.
This is probably an appropriate time to mention this. I get to write or send letters to our members that are celebrating their 100th birthday. 10 in November, 19 in December.
Wow.
We have 19 members turning 100 in December.
Wow.
That's amazing.
Yes.
And I remember you mentioned in September you had also 20 to 30. Okay. So this chart here, we've been talking about life expectancy, improvements in life expectancy. What we wanted to do for actuaries when we set the mortality assumptions, what we really do is we derive a mortality rate for each age. So here what we want to show you was what's been the average improvement, in this case decline, in the mortality rate on an annual basis over the last 25 years. You can see for female, it's been ranging between 1 to 3% a year in improvements. And for males, it's been, especially in the 60s, between the ages of 60 and 70, it's been ranging between 2 to 4% and then dropping. But you can see, we've had continuous improvement for the last 25 years. Now, I'm not sure if any of you are familiar with what we call heat maps. Heat maps are used frequently by demographers as a way to show you mortality improvements. And you can use heat maps for other things. But you basically have the years on the horizontal axis, the vertical axis are the ages. And the way to look at it is if you see blue or light or white colors, those are periods of low to no mortality improvements. Then when you see dark brown and orange, those are periods of heavy or high mortality improvements. This is just to show you how from one decade to the next things can change. So you can see that in the 90s, we didn't have a lot of mortality improvements. There were some, but if you look at remember the life expectancy chart that showed you, it remained fairly stable in the 90s. Then it's been increasing steadily ever since. So you can see it here. And the one thing I'd like to point out here, if you remember last February when we asked the board to delay the experience study, one of the reasons we mentioned is we had started to see a slowdown in mortality improvement in the rest of the US, and we were curious to see if we would see the same thing with our data. And you can see on the right-hand side, we're starting to see a little bit of blue creeping up. So we're also seeing, at least in the latest year of data, a slight slowdown compared to the previous years. Yeah. And then here we have the same thing for males. Same thing again. You can see a little bit of blue creeping out on the right. And again, the 2000s being higher than the 90s. So now we want to talk about the actual mortality assumption that you're going to be asked to adopt in February. So if you look at the mortality assumption that actuaries use, there's always two parts to it. You've got the easiest one to come up with, which is the reflection of how your members are, how long your members are living today. That's the easiest part to do because we can collect data and we can measure it. And the second part of the mortality assumption that sometimes becomes more subjective is with respect to improvements. What are we going to see in the future? How long are our members, how long are they projected to live tomorrow? So those are the two parts to our assumption. So for us, for the current table, we always use the period between the experience studies. So the current table we use today is based on 06 to 2010 experience, where now the new table you'll be asked to adopt will be based on 2010 to 2015 data. And then when it comes to mortality improvements, actuaries usually have two ways to actually reflect mortality improvements into their assumptions. There's something that's referred to as a static mortality improvement approach or the generational mortality. I'll tell you, you've heard us before, we will be recommending to go to generational mortality. But historically, what we have done, and that's also what most systems, or pretty much all systems did historically, everyone used a static approach, which is applying just a static margin that remains the same until you do another experience study. And this is what we've done historically here at CalSTRS. We've always used static improvement, something like in the case of the retirees, close to a 10% margin. So it's almost equivalent to lowering all the mortality rates by 10%. But the way we've done it for us here is we've used what are called setbacks. Setback is simply assuming if you have someone that's 55 years old today, let's say we'll assume that they live that their life expectancy will be similar to someone, let's say, age 50 today rather than 55. This is what a setback is. And that's what we've done historically. And historically, we've always had two tables here. We've had one table for our retirees, and then we've had a table that was even more conservative for future retirees, for those retiring in the future, which is unusual. I think if you look at most systems like CalPERS, they tend to use just one table for all members. So that's what we've done in the past. But going forward, we want to change this. We want to go to a generational approach. And the main reason is, I'll try to explain to you the difference between the two through this chart here. So when we do an experiment study and we derive mortality rates, we basically set a percentage, or like in this case, let's say we look at the data and we find out that 1% of the members that are age 70 die at that age. So that gives us a mortality rate of 1%. So if you have 100,000 members that are age 70, you'll expect 1,000 deaths per year. That's the orange line you see there. Our current approach is to have a static improvement, a flat improvement that remains the same for all years. So let's say we have a 10% improvement. Instead of expecting 1,000 deaths a year, we're now expecting 900 deaths a year. That's the purple line you see, and it's flat and it remains the same. So that when we do our actual projections, and remember, when we do projections, we go 50, 60, 70 years into the future. Under the static approach, someone at 70 today versus 70 in 10 years or 70 in 20 years, we use the exact same rate. What we want to start using is a more dynamic approach. Generational mortality builds mortality improvement every single year into the projection. So you actually start with a rate that's higher, a higher probability of death than using a static. But then over time, you add a little bit of improvements, and there's a point where they cross over. So what we want to go to is the green line, which is the ability to build mortality improvements into our projections. One of the drawbacks of the current method is we do an experiment study, we increase the life expectancy assumption, then it remains stable for 4 years. And then when we do a study and then we make corrections, these corrections tend to be large. So you have kind of this step approach here. Okay, this is our current approach. What we want to propose with generational, you get something that's a little bit smoother. So every year you would assume that life expectancy gets a little bit larger every year. So that's what we want to, this is what will be the recommendation to you in February. Again, these numbers are just for illustration purposes. They're not representative of our current life expectancy. We just wanted you to see that we will be going from a method that keeps everything stable for 4 years with a big correction to an approach where we would have improvements built into the valuation. And with respect to, do we have any questions so far? So we just want to point out that this is where most systems are going. We've looked at some of our peer systems. We've seen already 3 large state systems listed here that have gone to generational. I know that CalPERS is looking into it. When I was there, CalPERS tried to go to generational, but there were computer limitations that prevented them from going to this. I know that once they update their actual evaluation software, they will go to generational. We've talked to the actuaries at Ohio State Teachers System. They're going there as well. So we expect that probably 5-10 years from now, the vast majority of systems will be using this approach for mortality improvements. And the last thing I want to point out is one of the reasons why you didn't see this approach a lot in the past, you had 2 hurdles. One were computer limitations, which nowadays are pretty much gone with the computer power we have access to. But the other hurdle was often the administrative aspect of the system, the member calculations. Because generally you want, by statute, you need the assumptions for member calculations to be the same as the ones used for funding. So for us, we have different types of member calculations. Our current system cannot handle generational mortality, but we are currently working with CGI to make sure that this is built into our new pension solution system. But what we are planning to do to ensure that we, if you want, don't have a disconnect between our funding assumptions and the assumptions used for member calculations is we will be looking to still using something similar to static, if you want, for member calculations, using a table that we believe will give us sort of the same average costs over the 4-year period than we would have had we used generational. So those are kind of details that we have to work out behind the scene, but we have a plan. So we will be asking you to adopt generational mortality in February, and we will be, although we won't be using it for member calculation, we will be using something that will give us an equivalent answer to ensure that we keep that connection between the two. And that's pretty much it. So in February, the last thing I want to point out is for the first time, you will be actually, because we will be asking you to adopt generational mortality, we will now, instead of asking you to adopt a mortality table that has a margin built into it, you'll be asked to adopt a table that reflects how long our members live today. And then the other part of the recommendation will be an assumption as to future mortality improvements. So that will be built in February. So that will be a little bit different than what you've seen in the past.
So real quick, I have a question. So if we go to this generational and we add whatever percentage it is to keep that on a rate that improves, or at least, you understand what I mean.
Yeah.
How often then do we have to come back with an experience study or change our mortality tables?
So the hope with this is we're hoping that it will minimize the changes we need to do in the future. So once we adopt the mortality table, and let's say we come up with a 1%, the assumption is 1% improvement per year. If the improvements are close to 1%, then we would review that in the next experiment study. But if the improvements were in line with what we saw, there would be no need for the board to adopt a new mortality table. So the hope is that we will have a much more stable assumption, providing more stability long-term to cost and everything else.
I don't have anyone else with questions. So David, Rick, thank you very much for spending the past hour and a half, couple hours with us. We appreciate that. Thank you very much.
Thank you.